Now back to the Wisconsin Vegetable Gardener Radio Show, which is presented to you by Power Planter Earth Augers, the official digging tool to find the right size for your digging project. Visit powerplanter.com. Now here are your hosts, Joey and Holly Baird.
Welcome back to the Wisconsin Vegetable Gardener Radio Show. Appreciate you staying and hanging around. Holly, let's go to the hotline and bring in our guest for the week.
Linda Ly is a plant lover, passionate road tripper, and cookbook author whose savvy advice and best-selling books have been featured in Time, Outside, and Food and Wine. She has a website full of garden info at gardenbetty.com. So we are curious why your website is titled Garden Betty and your name is Linda.
Well, I started my blog back in 2010, and I was living in Southern California at the time. I also surfed and snowboarded a lot, along with gardening as my passions. So down there, a common nickname for a girl who's into the extreme sports world is a Betty. So when it came time to think of a name for my blog, I combined Garden and Betty to come up with a name that was actually available, not knowing that it would later become a brand, and the name has just stuck with me.
One of those stories that not everybody knows the secrets behind.
Yeah, this is how brands are made, or these very strange behind the scenes.
Well, you're a fan of the Florida weave trellising method that people use for tomatoes, as we are as well. What is the Florida weave for people who are not familiar, and why do you use it, and how do you construct yours? What kind of material do you make yours out of?
So the Florida weave is a method of staking your tomato plants, and I really love it because it uses materials that are very easy to find. They're inexpensive, and it's quick to erect. It also doesn't require any storage space at the end of the season. What you do is take 2 stakes and you place them on either side of your tomato plants, or you could have 2 or 3 tomatoes between your 2 stakes. And then what you do is you take a length of twine, a heavy duty twine, and you sandwich your plants in between the twine, you sandwich the plants in between the twine, just running them back and forth between each stake. So as the plants grow taller, you just add another row of twine on top of the one before that. So you're technically weaving the plants in a figure-8 pattern to hold them upright as they grow up. My favorite materials to use for the Florida weave is to take steel fence T-posts, because they're thin, but they're extremely sturdy. They're at the perfect height. Usually I get the 7 or 8 foot tall T-posts. And then you can just strike it into the ground about a foot, maybe 2 feet, depending on, how windy your weather is. And when you use a twine, say a tomato twine or a hemp twine, which is my preference because it's very durable, those materials can last several seasons. And so they don't get rusty. You don't have to keep replacing them. So it's very efficient.
And because of the Florida weave, we find you can pack a few more tomatoes in an area versus the cages that kind of take up the space the spacing is a little tighter on the Florida weave tomatoes than the cages. Do you find that, or do you still keep the spacing relatively the same depending on the method?
I do space my tomatoes smaller, so I typically have a 4x8 raised bed, which is how I grow most of my plants, and I can actually fit 6 indeterminate tomato plants in that space using 2 Florida weave trellises. So it's 2 rows of the Florida weave. That leaves about 18 inches between each plant, and I find that it's plenty. They actually grow over 8 feet tall every year.
Yeah, they're definitely very helpful trellis. Now, aphids are the ticks of the garden world. We're always talking about them. What are your best tips for dealing with aphids, controlling aphids, ridding yourself of aphids?
Yeah, aphids are a big challenge in the garden. I see them most often in the beginning of the season and at the end of the season, and it's usually a response to some kind of plant stress. And that's why they show up. So I feel that the best way to prevent aphids from happening in the first place is to catch an infestation early, because once the numbers multiply, it's almost impossible to treat your plant. A fun little fact is that all of the aphids in spring and summer are females, and they can lay eggs and produce more. They give live birth without the use of a male, and so they can produce many, many generations of aphids all at once. And that's why they explode seemingly overnight.
Yeah, kind of evil type of bug whenever that type of thing occurs. Yeah.
So if you see, a few kind of straggling on your leaves, my suggestion is to always pick off that leaf immediately and then toss it into your trash, because you don't want them to continue reproducing and possibly affecting your other plants. So inspect your plants early and often and get rid of any of the leaves that are infected. That can reduce your chances of an invasion pretty well. If you miss them, because they do like to hide on the undersides of leaves or like deep in the rosettes of plants like broccoli, a good way to remove them is to just get a garden hose and blast them with a strong jet of water. So that kind of dislodges them from the leaves, and that works really well. But you do have to keep applying the water, I would say 2 or 3 times a week until the population is diminished. And if that fails,
right,
then I usually resort to an insecticidal soap, and I make that at home, using just, plain, Castile soap and water and an essential oil to help repel the insects, usually a peppermint or eucalyptus or lavender. And then you can apply that red on the aphids, and that actually, affects their exoskeletons. It effectively kills them.
And this year we've found, and maybe you have seen the same thing, there's a lot of new gardeners that are trying to garden for the very first time for a vast variety of reasons. And we always encourage people that, hey, you're going to have bug problems. You're going to have plants that die. It's not a failure. It's a learning experience, because you, as well as Holly and myself, we are learning every day, and we do this for a living when it comes to the gardening world.
Yeah, and sometimes aphids, I feel like, everybody thinks of them as the bad bug because they are so destructive and they can pretty much wipe out your entire crop. But when you look at the good side of things, they actually tell you that something is off balance in your garden so that you can take action somewhere else. So maybe it's not diverse enough and you need to introduce more flowers to attract more of the beneficial insects to your garden. Maybe you're underwatering, maybe you're overwatering. You're creating some sort of stress in the environment, and that's why the aphids show up. So if you can get to the root of the problem, not just get rid of the aphids, but find out why your irrigation isn't working, shade your plants if there's just too much sunlight and too much heat on them. Maybe you're applying too much nitrogen. So all of these factors are things to look at, trying to prevent the aphids.
Okay, so now we love growing garlic, and many of us may not always know when it's time to harvest, especially when it comes to something like a hard neck versus a soft neck. What are some good tips that you have learned to determine when to harvest garlic?
For me, it's all in the leaves. The best way to tell when you need to harvest garlic is just to look at the amount of green leaves versus brown or dead leaves that are on the plant. Depending on the garlic variety, your harvest period can be anywhere between May and August. It also depends on when you planted them and where your region is, whether you're in like a northern or southern. So leaves are the most reliable indicator. They start dying from the bottom, and as the weeks go on through late spring to summer, each row, each set of lower leaves will continue to brown and wilt, and they'll just continue dying off bit by bit. When you see that about half of the leaves have died off, then that's a good time to check your garlic. And you just dig a little bit into the soil, check out the size of the bulb to see if it's like a good hefty size. And if it is, you can pull it. If you feel like it should have another week or two to keep growing, then you just mow the soil back on and then keep watching the leaves. But you definitely don't want, say, 75% of the leaves or all of the leaves to die off, because at that point, it's too late to harvest.
Understand. Now, we're seeing this very prevalent in the southern garden area, and we get a lot of questions about blossom end rot, which is one of the most common problems that people will face with their tomato plants. What are some tips that you can offer for people who are dealing with this problem? And that is the fruit that is ripe, but when you harvest it, it's black and rotten on the bottom portion of it.
Yeah, so the first thing I would tell people is that even though it's unsightly on the bottom, if the rest of the tomato has grown perfectly normally, you can actually cut off that sunken spot and then eat the part of the tomato that's not disfigured, because it's a disfigurement. It's a physiological condition, so it's not affected by bacteria. It's not from fungi. That's not diseased in any way. It just looks ugly. And the reason why that happens is because the plant is unable to use the calcium from the soil effectively. And that's what causes that sunken spot. Usually it happens with the first flush of the season because the plant is just getting its bearings and reproducing. And that tends to resolve itself, as the season goes on. But what makes it more likely to happen is when people use a little bit too much nitrogen in the beginning, because they encourage this big flush of foliage to grow and grow and grow. When you have that many leaves, the fruit don't really have a chance to catch up, and grow to like a good size. And the leaves end up taking all of the calcium for themselves, leaving very little for the fruit. And that's why they get blossom end rot. One of the common misconceptions is that people think blossom end rot is due to not having enough calcium in the soil. But in truth, most garden soil, especially if you've grown a lot of plants in it before, that has a sufficient amount of soil, but the plant is just not able to use that soil and pull it up. It needs a good amount of water and a good consistent moisture to be able to circulate the calcium throughout the leaves and throughout the fruits. So a good way to make sure that you don't get blossom end rot is to be consistent with your watering. You don't want to let it go through periods of drought. You definitely don't want to overwater it because tomatoes don't like having too much water. You just want to give it a good deep soaking once, maybe twice a week, depending on how hot it is.
Well, before we let you go, I want to ask you about seed starting mix. Many people have already started their seeds. They've got them in the ground. And sooner or later here, these garden centers will have potting mixes on sale because they're trying to clean out inventory. Would you advise gardeners of any level to purchase those potting soil mixes and then just store them in the garage or basement so they're ready to go next year? Or is it best to buy new potting soil in the January or the early portions of the growing season, the coming growing season? What would you advise people on that?
Generally, if you're buying a good basic potting mix, it doesn't really have a shelf life. As long as you keep it dry and you store it in a good place, you can continue to use that year after year. The only time that I would caution people from buying any kind of potting mix on discount is if they claim to have like live microbials or any of these special enhancements in the soil, because any kind of microbial or is not going to continue to live, especially if you're storing it in a hot garage or a hot shed.
Good advice to have there. Well, we greatly appreciate you taking time with us, Linda. How can people find out more about you? Where can they go and find your books and your website?
So they can find out more about me at gardenbuddy.com, which is my blog. I talk about edible gardening, urban homesteading, farm-to-table cooking, raising chickens. I also have a new book out called The No Waste Vegetable Cookbook, which helps you save money on the food that you grow or buy. And it teaches you how to use up all of the parts of the vegetables that you never knew you could eat. So this is especially fun for gardeners who ever wondered if you could eat, say, tomato leaves or zucchini shoots or cucumber shoots. And there's recipes for all of that in my book. And on social media, you can find me at Garden Buddy.
Well, Linda, we greatly appreciate the time and the knowledge not only that you've shared with Holly and myself, but all of our listeners from across the country.
I appreciate you having me.
Well, thank you for that.
For more information, please visit thewisconsinvegetablegardener.com.